Well, welcome everyone. I think we're ready to start. Welcome to this session of the Global Church Series, especially the sessions dedicated to the Church in Africa. I'm Father Paul Kollman, a Holy Cross priest and a theology professor here at the University of Notre Dame, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this today's session, the topic of which will be the history of Christianity in Africa. Last week, 1 week ago, we looked at specifically the Catholic Church in Africa today. And next week, we'll be looking at the future of the Catholic Church in Africa. Today, we want to focus on the history of Christianity in Africa, trying to understand the roots and causes of some of the contemporary realities, also to kind of highlight some of the challenges and victories and opportunities that the Catholic Church and other Christian bodies in Africa have faced over the last 2 millennia. Let me begin by acknowledging the very generous sponsors of this series. I'm a faculty member in theology, specifically the area of world religions, world church, and my colleagues and our program is one of the sponsors. Other sponsors include the College of Arts and Letters here at Notre Dame, the McGrath Institute for Church Life here at Notre Dame, the Tantur Ecumenical Institute in Jerusalem, the Jerusalem Global Gateway, and of course, as well, the Alumni Association, who is sponsoring this ThinkND program and who has been such a wonderful partner as we put together the materials that are shared online and also have these sessions so well organized. I really am grateful to you for your participation. It's a beautiful afternoon here in South Bend, a great day for our students to be distracted from their studies. I hope it's beautiful where you are as well. We've had a somewhat early spring and campus just looks spectacular. Lots of great flowering trees and flowers. It's a good time to be thinking about Christianity as a global phenomenon and to think about the vitality of our faith. A couple of things, this session is going to proceed like others in the series. I'm going to be having a conversation with a current student, a friend of mine, Father Kenneth Amadi, and he will be joining shortly. Father Ken and I will be talking about a number of questions arising from our presentations. Welcome, Father Ken. After we have a back and forth of about half an hour to 45 minutes, maybe a little longer, we will be going into conversation circles and breakout sessions, and you're welcome to join those. You don't have to. You're welcome to sign off at that time. But otherwise, if you do sign off, it will be great to see you next week, I hope. There is in the chat function of your Zoom capacity, the chance to enter questions. And for the last 15 or so minutes of Father Ken's and my conversation, we will be addressing questions that you've sent in. And we'll try to address those together. Sometimes they can be more targeted to one of us or the other, and feel free to list that in your question, whether they are addressed more to Father Ken or to me or to both of us. And it could be that even if it's addressed to one or the other one weighs in simply because it's relevant to our research or what we know about. This week, in looking at the history of Christianity in Africa, I had prepared some short video presentations that were shared with some of you, and I hope you had some time to look at those, as well as some reading materials and other video possibilities to kind of fill in some of the information. I offered in those videos 3 things. First, offered a historical framework highlighting 3 so-called stages in the history of Christianity in Africa. The second looked at foundations for the global Christian movement, Christian churches all over the world, that have their foundation and origin in the African Christian experience, especially in the early church, but even later. And finally, looking at features of African Christianity that are traceable to that history. And to consider some of those issues, I would like to welcome my friend and student, Father Kenneth Amadi. Father Ken is a priest of the archdiocese of Abuja, the capital of Nigeria. Nigeria is the largest country in sub-Saharan Africa by population, by quite a bit. There are probably 180 or 190 million people living in Nigeria, and about 40% of them or so are Christians. So Nigeria has the largest single Christian population in the continent. and it has the second largest Catholic population in the continent. Abuja, where Father Ken is a priest, is in the archdiocese. It's the capital of the country. And it's a city of about 3 or 4 million people. It's a large city. But Nigeria has other large cities, including where Father Ken spent a good deal of his life, the largest city in sub-Saharan Africa. Well, in Africa, Lagos, Nigeria, maybe has 20 million people. And his ethnic origins put him in the southeast of the country among the Igbo people, who are predominantly Catholic. So he has a really interesting personal experience in his childhood and young adulthood, growing up in different places within the country, the north or the central part of the country where Abuja is located, the southeast, where Lagos and Ibadan, the two largest cities in the country, are located. He lived in Lagos, but his kind of family origins would be in the south or the southwest. In the southeast, his family origins are in the southeast, where the Igbo people are the largest single group, and he himself, that's his ethnic origins. Hey, welcome, Father Ken. It's great to have you with us. Father Ken has endured one of my classes in its entirety a year ago, and is now suffering through another class with me, a doctoral seminar in world Christianity. So besides having to endure me twice a week for an hour and 15 minutes, he's willing to join us for this today. Welcome, Father Ken.
Thank you so much, Father Paul. It's a pleasure to be here. And by the way, it's been a very, very big pleasure to be in your classes so far.
Yeah, well, that might not help you with your grade, but I appreciate it. Thank you so much. All right, so Father Ken, feel free to take it away as we kind of sift through some of the questions that we prepared, and then get ready to welcome questions from others.
Sure. So picking up from where you have left off, I want to welcome everyone again, and then to say immediately that one of the reasons why this forum is taking place is that we find that there are so many people in Africa and outside Africa who do not yet know much about Christianity in the African continent. I mean, my own personal deficiencies in knowledge about African Christianity proves to me that this might be the case for so many people, especially people who haven't done any studies on African Christianity. And so, Father Paul, what do you think about this deficiency, wide deficiency in knowledge about African Christianity, and how remarkable will this be for people to know more about Africa?
What a great question. Thanks, Father Ken. And I think it's a great place to start, because one of the reasons why I do my research, I mean, I sort of focus on the history of Christianity in Africa, especially Catholic missionaries in Eastern Africa, sort of my specialization, is in some ways to give African Christians and their leaders a past that is usable for them to live in the present in a vital way. Many of the people on this call are going to be citizens of the United States, and we know that we value understandings of our own history that allow us to live responsibly in the present, generously, compassionately, honestly, with integrity. And we're wary of stories about the past that narrow our vision, that keep us from the kind of dreams that those who founded the country wanted the country to live into. And I think African Christians face the same kind of challenges. So to make sense of the North African experience of the first 6, 7 centuries of the Christian era, to make sense of other later kind of ways that Christianity came into the continent, I think just help African Christians have a sense of themselves as a living tradition, giving them resources to make sense of their experiences in the present. It's not unknown to most people that Africa has been a continent where suffering has occurred, but suffering there is not new, and it's also not unique to Africa. I mean, I think about the Civil War in our country, in which one of the sides really defended the slavery of people of African origins based on religious grounds. It was a misreading of the scriptures, and they used the Bible to defend enslaving African Americans. That was a bad vision of the Christian past that led to a lot of suffering in North America for people of African descent, and robbed us of lots of vitality as a nation for a long time. And in some ways, the shadow of that might persist to the present. We can argue about how much for a long time. It certainly, to me, does persist to the present. But Africans want the same bright future for their children. And I think to know their past, African Christians to know their past. I mean, I'd welcome your insights into that too. You've now done a couple years of doctoral studies here, as well as a master's here, I think, and your own seminary studies and other education in Nigeria. I'd love to hear what you think. You're in a country with lots of very excited Christians for whom faith is so very important. Love to hear your sense of this too.
No, beautiful. I think that it's very helpful that in the videos that you provide before this forum, you establish the 3 stages, the 3 plantings in the development of the history of Christianity in Africa. Many people who are just daily communion receiving Catholics do not really know anything about this development of the history of Christianity. It's even more fascinating to know that Christianity goes as far back as the 1st centuries of its origins, in Africa. Even though many people do not associate the developments of Christianity in North Africa to contemporary worldview of African Christianity, which is mainly based in sub-Saharan Africa, it's still very wonderful to know that Christianity takes a lot of its original impetus in Africa. And moving on from there, Christianity, apart from the 1st centuries, came to Africa in the late 15th century and early 16th century in what is today parts of Angola and the Congo and Mozambique through Portuguese explorers. I would like to know, and I would like our audience to know more about why this failed and how this becomes a lesson, so to speak, for later developments in missionary activities in Africa, which begins from the 19th century.
Yeah, thanks, Father Ken. One way to answer that is to sort of say, well, it did fail eventually, but there were a couple centuries of really vital Catholic presence, especially in the West African Kingdom of the Congo, which had diplomatic relations with the Vatican, which had a rich liturgical and artistic life shaped by the encounter of Catholic Christianity with Congolese culture, which generated interesting prophets like the Congolese Saint Anthony, Beatrice Kimpavita, who I mentioned in the video. Now, why it failed is complicated. I would say a couple things. One, the Portuguese were not energetic missionaries from a colonial perspective. They never really dominated politically the Kingdom of the Congo. And they didn't have a large population base with lots of people to send to do evangelization. I would say the Kingdom of the Congo had its own internal conflicts that kept it from being stable for very long. But one major source of those conflicts was the contested relationship with European powers that were coming in and often trading for slaves whom they would export across the Atlantic. And it's very hard to quantify the number of slaves taken from the Congo, but some people think that in about a 15-year period of civil war and then the repression after the Civil War, that something like 10 to 15% of their population might have been exported to Brazil, the Caribbean, and even North America. And there's evidence that they took their Congolese Catholicism with them into the New World, shaping the emergence of African American Christianity in now North and South and Central America and the Caribbean. And one of the things about the expansion of and growth of Christianity in sub-Saharan Africa is that it really did help plant Christianity among people of African descent in North and South America. Many of those who went there as slaves were Christians and in some cases Muslims. And so each of these religions had a foothold even before such people would have been evangelized by colonizers who were British and French or Spanish or Portuguese or Dutch or Danish in the Caribbean. So it's a fascinating story that's increasingly appreciated by historians. And I like thinking about, one of the great gifts that North American Christianity has given to the world is the distinctive ways that African Americans have read the scriptures, especially as a text of liberation. In some ways, that was due to the great suffering they endured, which we don't want to make a virtue out of, because it was the result of real human sinfulness. On the other hand, that's a gift Christianity in North America has given to the world. And so it's a kind of interesting, counterintuitive result and conclusion to draw. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would immediately also like to add one of the major elements which many scholars have alluded to as militating against the success of the mission in the Portuguese, the Congo, Africa, is what they call the principle of supplanting. A lot of supplanting of African cultural elements and radical replacement with Christian elements would have been responsible for why the mission failed. And this was not so much unlike what happened with the 19th century missionaries in sub-Saharan Africa. Even though their mission was largely more successful and had greater vibes, there was also this integration of, some at least inchoate sense of inculturation in the later phase of European mission. However, we still see that in this part of the continent, quickly, many African indigenous churches arose, some of which arose allegedly because of struggle for independence, both in terms of leadership and in terms of indigenous faith expression. Could you talk a little bit about these African independent churches and what implications they had for early missions and later missionary and even indigenous Christian practices in Africa?
Thanks, Father Ken. Great questions. And glad to have you weigh in, because in some ways, Nigeria is one of the places with some of the earliest and most vital African initiated churches. They're sort of just called AICs, and people argue about what the I ought to stand for: independent, initiated, indigenous. But if we just call them African AICs, African Independent or Initiated or Indigenous Churches, that's right. You're right insofar as there are lots of different kinds of these, thousands of them, and thousands of them just in Nigeria that are separate from one another. And some of them clearly do have their origins in the stubbornness of missionaries hanging on to the missionary Christianity that Africans took up and took seriously. But missionaries really held on to the leadership in such a way as to kind of frustrate Africans who had deep leadership skills and wanted to be able to assume responsibility for the churches that they were making up the vast majority of members of. So some of them have the roots in that. And you're also right that a growing number of them have their roots in cultural values that are important to African peoples that missionary Christianity had difficulty accommodating. Now, I do think the Congolese Catholic Kingdom is an interesting one, because there we are increasingly finding evidence that, in fact, it was a very enculturated Christianity. That the Congolese episode, at least, really showed a lot of initiative by the Congolese as they made Catholicism their own over a 2.5 century period, from 1500 to the early 18th century. Other places in Africa later, with that third planting in the modern missionary movement, linked in some ways to European colonialism, much more of a mixed record, as you yourself would know. Sometimes missionaries came there very much anxious to squash local culture, which they viewed as pagan and primitive and impossible to fuse with Christianity. There are certainly exceptional missionaries who saw further, who saw the gift of African cultural genius. There were too few of them, and often they were swallowed up in colonial processes that in and of themselves robbed African peoples of their dignity and independence and chance for kind of self-organization. But nonetheless, that cultural genius has persisted. And you can find it flourishing in African initiated churches, AICs, many places in many ways. one of the things I think you're trying to study in your own work, and I'm trying to enact in my own, is that the Catholic Church itself would be a place where we'd recognize and celebrate efforts where the Africans made the church their own, and thus have been able to contribute to the global Catholic Church, or the Christian churches to which they belong, regular mainline Protestant or Pentecostal. And these days, as you well know, African independent churches are global. There are thousands of African independent church believers who pray in African independent churches in the United States every Sunday. Thousands. Not only in big cities, but primarily in our larger cities. There'd be African independent churches, many of them traceable to Nigeria or Ghana or to South Africa, others to other places on the continent. So African independent churches aren't just in Africa, they're global. The largest church in Europe on a given Sunday is a Nigerian founded church that meets in Kiev in the Ukraine. The most believers on a given Sunday are in Kiev in the Ukraine. It's a Nigerian founded church, not Catholic, but yeah.
Interesting. And would these worship in the Ukrainian language or in their own indigenous languages? Because one of the very beautiful characteristics of these African initiated churches is that they promote a lot of their own cultural heritage, one of which is language. And again, the Congolese mission in the Portuguese mission in the Congo has been criticized as not being interested in the language of the people. But I would also imagine that this would have been the case for many of the early missions. I mean, of course, until Vatican II, worship was basically in Latin in most parts of the world.
Catholics, yeah. Yeah, it's a great, I think the Nigerian church in Kiev prays in English. I think it's a Pentecostal church, and I think they pray in English, which attracts lots of Europeans, other Europeans who live in Kiev, who want Pentecostal worship. Not just, and there are Ukrainians there, but there are also other European expatriates, as well as Africans who live in Kiev, who are doing all sorts of kind of work there. You're right that language is a crucial thing, right? And missionaries sometimes were slower and sometimes faster in both understanding local languages and appreciating their richness, learning how to translate certain aspects of the Christian faith. Certainly Protestant missionaries were more rapid than Catholic in wanting to translate the Bible. It was really a priority for them to get the Bible in local languages so that individual believers could read it and hear it in their own language. Catholics tended to translate aspects of the Bible for worship, but also the catechism. So they would translate the French catechism or the English catechism or the Italian or German catechism into the local language before they translated the entire Bible. These days, of course, as you probably know, those translation processes are usually cooperative, different Christian bodies, Catholics working with other Protestants and Pentecostals at times to translate the Bible into new languages in which it's not yet been translated.
Perfect. So let us transition a little bit to something more different. Sometimes there is a distinction between primary evangelization, bringing the gospel to people who never were exposed to it, and then the ongoing evangelization of Christians, sometimes also called pastoral care for people who already have received the faith. In addition, sometimes people use the term new evangelization with reference to evangelizing places and people once predominantly Christian who no longer practice the faith or in whom the faith is no longer as vibrant. Are these terms useful for Africa's history or current circumstances?
It's a great question. I'd love to hear your response to that too. Certainly there are places in Africa where there is still primary evangelization. There are people in remote places in some countries who have never heard of Christianity or Islam, but they are certainly decreasing in number, I would say. There are fewer and fewer places untouched by global religions. And interestingly, of course, if you've heard about Islam, you might have also heard about Christianity, because many Muslims think of Islam as kind of building on Christianity. by Islam. So, but that primary evangelization happens for sure. The extent to which it is the norm, I would say, is less and less. These days, a whole lot of people, even people coming from other countries like the United States who work in Africa, actually do pastoral care of already Christian congregations. For instance, the Holy Cross they used to in the 1950s and 60s when Holy Cross first went to these places, but these days we staff parishes where ongoing evangelization happens because children are born and have to be raised in the faith. And small Christian communities, as we discussed last week, create vital faith communities out of these parishes. The new evangelization is a term that I think was coined by John Paul II and taken up by Benedict, even to talk, I think, primarily almost about Europe, because for both of those popes, Europe seemed a place that was receding in its Christian allegiance, where practices of the faith were decreasing. So I don't think of much of Africa that way, but certainly certain cities, for instance, in South Africa, which would be a more secularized country than most of Africa, would have something like that kind of secularized, lower participation in Christian affiliation. I don't think of that the same way as Benedict XVI and John Paul II used new evangelization, and not many people use it that way. One of the interesting things that's happening, of course, is that Africans are carrying out new evangelization in Europe and North America. I mean, it's not surprising to find, when you go into cities like London or Paris or Berlin, even Rome, where everybody officially might be 80 or 90% Christian, but very few people practice a lot. It's going to be African congregations that are doing outreach, trying to re-evangelize these one-time Christians who no longer practice their faith. Yeah, but I'd be glad to hear your own thoughts about those terms too.
Yeah, I think you are right in saying that primary evangelization is more and more going down and down as more people hear about Christ or hear about Muhammad, as the case may be, depending on their own religious affiliation. I want to dwell more on the concepts of ongoing evangelization and new evangelization. As far as I'm concerned, these two terms can be used interchangeably. And the way that I tend to approach new evangelization is not so much in terms of bringing the message of the gospel to people who never have heard it, or to people in whose hearts the message has completely died, because it never dies. It is the work of the Holy Spirit to implant the message in people's hearts, since the Holy Spirit is the primary agent of evangelization. But to the extent that people have, developed, some kind of coldness to the fire of the word, to that extent, they need to be evangelized. John Paul uses concepts like evangelizing with new ardor and new methods and, new techniques, which is one of the things that, we see in the world today, how evangelization has, come to take place and develop. You are also right in pointing out how Africa is doing a lot in terms of mission in Europe and America. You need not go far. I am here in St. Joseph Parish in Mishawaka, not necessarily preaching to a people in whose hearts the fire of the message of the gospel has died down, but to also bring, from my own religious and cultural experience in Africa, new ways of seeing and new ways of being Christian. I also live in this parish with another Nigerian priest, Father Joachim, and it is amazing how much, this synergy of American Catholicism and African Catholicism has enriched the parish, and how much we too ourselves have been enriched by this exchange. I tend to put all of these within the broad category of new evangelization. And it's really, really interesting for how Christians of our time accept the message with, an open heart.
Great. Just one thing, Father Joachim is also a PhD student, right? Or is he a master's degree student?
He is finishing his master's and will be transitioning to the PhD program this fall.
Terrific. Can I ask a question about your own research? You're in liturgical studies. In some ways, liturgical studies is about new evangelization insofar as it defines and names the practice that believers carry out every week when they worship together.
Absolutely.
And it seems to me to be the major or one of the major instruments through which ongoing pastoral care / new evangelization is going to happen. Can you talk about your own kind of research and maybe also your impressions of worship from where you've come from and where you are now?
Wonderful, sure. So as a student of liturgical studies, it's been very interesting to study all of these different historical developments of the way that Christians have worshipped over time from the beginnings of, even before the coming of Christ, how some of the elements of religious worship in Judaism and other religions play into our own Christian faith. But more specifically, my research is focused on the development of religious imagination in Nigeria. Particularly, I'm studying Nigerian Catholics and how they think about God and the world and the relationship between God and people and the world. I'm trying to articulate this through the study of specific rituals within the official liturgy, something that would strike an American as completely unimaginable. You know, there are many elements of our own worship in Nigeria that are particular to Nigeria that you might not even find in other African countries. For instance, there is something called the post-communion Thanksgiving, which may or may not exist in other African countries, but definitely which does not exist in Europe or America. I'm just going to give a 1-minute description of this ritual, which hinges on so many things. So after post-communion prayer, usually individuals or families who have reasons to thank God in specific ways, maybe for a new house, for a new car, for successful marriage, for deliverance from an accident, and things like that, they come forward with the entire church or their friends and family joining them and dancing to the altar, you know, dancing to very joyous music in praise of God. Interestingly, they do not come empty-handed. They come bearing gifts, concrete gifts, ranging from livestock or fruits or foods or other items that could be used in the church. And they present these things to the church, the priest who receives it in the name of the church. And so the idea is that people take Thanksgiving very seriously in Nigeria, and this is an integral part of worship. Not like people do not take Thanksgiving seriously in the US, but what Thanksgiving means for us in liturgical worship is different from what Thanksgiving means for people in the US. And in this ritual of post-communion Thanksgiving, the priest prays over the people, thanking God for what God has done for them and also asking for more favors and blessings, and sprinkles them with holy water. Again, the symbol of holy water goes beyond just remembering our baptism. It also is an expression of God's blessing upon these people and God's protection upon these people. So this is just one among many rituals that are specific to Nigeria or to a few African countries as far as liturgy goes. So these are ways in which we try to make meaning of the Christian mystery and the Christian message, and how we can better be able, and how we can better understand ourselves as church. And so if, for instance, Joachim or I decide to introduce this here in the parish with the permission of the parish priest, it becomes, you know, one more new reality for how Christianity can be practiced. And over time, you never know how this kind of practice begins to spread from one American parish to the other. And maybe in the next 100 years, it becomes a universally accepted ritual practice. And so that's how liturgical development, adaptation occurs.
I'm a little worried we might get either curses or blessings and joys of jubilation due to Notre Dame football outcomes on Sunday churches in South Bend or Mishawaka. Yeah, I mean, I think what you've described in some ways is an organic connection between the joy people have over the Eucharist and their faith and connecting it to the lives they are experiencing. It makes me wonder about how something like affliction finds its way into liturgical practice. I mean, those are kind of reasons for joy, but how do you consecrate, as it were, affliction? That is, put it in God's sight so that the blessings of God can address it as well. Any thoughts about that? That seems to be a bigger challenge, not just for the African Catholics or Christians, but for a lot of people.
Thank you very much for bringing the question of affliction. As we all know, Africa is a place where people struggle with lots of affliction, ranging from poverty or terrorism or killings and things like that. In Professor Kimberly Belcher's class and in her scholarship, she has been doing a lot with ritual studies and particularly rituals of affliction, for which she taught a class last semester for which I was her teaching assistant. And taking that class made me realize that we haven't really developed enough rituals to address afflictions within our own liturgical and sacramental life. And this is an area that we need to pay serious attention to, because unless and until people begin to feel healing, then they begin to seek healing or cure in places where their faith would ordinarily not lead them. So if we pay attention to these rites of affliction and rituals of, healing, then it will do us better good. I'm sure liturgical scholars like Kim are working hard to develop these kinds of rituals. Some of them might be rituals that are more pro tem, addressing specific issues that arise from time to time. Some of them may be more sacramentally ingrained rituals. For instance, the sacrament of penance is actually a rite of affliction, just as we also, have occasional penitential services. These are rites of affliction. So if we pay more attention to that, I think it will be wonderful for how different cultures and different societies deal with not only moments of blessing, but also moments of crisis and affliction.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, and thanks for thinking about it. I mean, anybody who reads the international news is aware that, for instance, Nigeria's north has been afflicted by Boko Haram, who have seized school kids and caused lots of mayhem. And there's other unrest in the country, not simply due to Boko Haram, but due to kind of ethnic tensions between cattle herders and agrarian people. I'm thinking about, in terms of affliction as well, Ken, the student in our class, Father Jean-Baptiste Mvukiyehe, is a Rwandese priest, a member of the Palatines, a Catholic religious order. Mm-hmm. And Jean-Baptiste has been very active in rites of reconciliation post-genocide in Rwanda. He was one of the priests at a shrine that had ritualized rites of reconciliation for those who had committed atrocities and those who had suffered them or had family members killed or maimed by them. And these rites are emergent, not unlike the kind of post-communion blessing in Nigeria. They're not formalized, right? But different Christian communities are figuring out ways to ritualize the affliction they've suffered and to kind of move toward the reconciliation they seek. And I'm aware of Jean-Baptiste himself personally participating in some of that, and he's presented here to the Keough School of Global Affairs and the Kroc Institute for Peace Studies about his work. And it's just a sign that the gift of Christ's resurrection is a gift that, which we celebrate in these days of Easter, seems to me a gift that can amplify things like the blessings that the post-communion blessing in Nigeria celebrates, and also soothe aspects of human experience that are replete with terrible suffering, and create meaning and rebuild relationships and create new unity from really desperate circumstances. I wonder if we ought to turn to some of the questions we've received from some of the people who are participating now. Is that okay with you, Father Ken?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to read one of them. This question is from Whitestone, New York, and I ask it because I have a lot to say about it, but I think, Father Ken, you might also have something to say about it. It says, are you familiar with the novel Purple Hibiscus by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie? I just finished it and was surprised to read of the strong influence of Catholicism in present-day Nigeria. I read Things Fall Apart and taught it as an English teacher and encountered Christian missionary work. Do you feel these literary works, both of which are by Nigerian Christians, are accurate reflections of the Christian Catholic influence in Nigeria? Have you read The Purple Hibiscus, Father Ken?
I have read only a little bit of it in high school, but not in recent times. Last year, I read her other work, Half of a Yellow Sun, which was also fascinating, and also reread Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. Great.
I've now taught The Purple Hibiscus about 4 times to Notre Dame students in my class, Christianity in Africa. The author is, again, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who's a widely respected author globally, lives in the United States now, but a Nigerian Catholic from the southeastern part of the country. And the novel is a beautiful story. It's kind of a coming-of-age novel with violence in it and family violence, and also Nigeria's own political suffering, especially in the 1990s. I commend it to you as readers, The Purple Hibiscus. It's terrific. And it's the kind of book that high schoolers could read with profit, I think. The reason I teach it, and I teach it early in my course, is because it presents Catholicism as something natural for African believers. The thing about Things Fall Apart, which was written in the early 60s, is it presents Christianity as an intrusion. It's much more of an historical work, so that missionary Christianity comes and amplifies local disorder in the town where the events take place, Umuofia. And the flawed main character, Okonkwo, his flaws just get amplified because of missionary Christianity in some ways. But it doesn't paint Africa as totally amazing and without any conflicts before Christianity, but missionary Christianity intensifies the tragedy of the story, I would say. There are other novels like that by the Kenyan Ngugi wa Thiong'o, The River Between, which I have also taught. But I really do like The Purple Hibiscus, and I'm glad one of the questioners asked about it. Any thoughts about those 2 novels or other novels you feel like capture the Christian experience in Africa?
I think what I'll just immediately say is that anyone who wants to learn about Africa in a more organic and natural way should read African novels. Yeah. You may get much more from African novels than you will get from intellectual works, which are more like the musings of scholars than they are of, very emic presentation of what is happening in Africa. But that being said, each author writes from their own experience and from their own perspective of the matter. If Adichie talks about Catholicism coming naturally to Africans, yes, I could make that claim for people in the southeastern part of Africa, more so than people in the northern part of Africa or western part of Africa, of Nigeria. So in the southwestern part of Nigeria, where many of these African indigenous churches are more vibrant, even Roman Catholics of the southwest would worship in a different way and would approach religion in a much different way than people in the southeast. And someone who sees people from these 2 extractions of Nigeria worship would not think of them as, approaching the faith in exactly the same way. So I would rather say that each ethnic group in Nigeria worships from their own cultural and religious, specific cultural and religious worldview, more so than from a general religious worldview.
Great. Ken, the next question that maybe we could consider comes from Ottawa. I think that's Ottawa, Canada, the capital of that country. It asks about ecumenism and interreligious dialogue comparatively between the United States and Africa. I'd love to have you can start talking some about that, and I'll weigh in as possible.
Sure. I am happy to talk about ecumenism in North America versus Africa. I would say that ecumenism, if we understand it as the relationship between or among Christian churches, has had far greater success in North America than it has in Africa. Speaking from my own Nigerian experience, I think that the relationship between Christian churches has, for the most part, been fraught with so many tensions that play both into political or cultural dimensions. There is great antagonism between, for instance, Nigerian Pentecostals and Nigerian Catholics on both sides. Yeah. Just as there is antagonism between Protestants and Catholics, although less so than that between Catholics and Pentecostals. Another element is that in North America, we have lots of churches from the Orthodox tradition in a way that we do not have in Nigeria, for instance. The Orthodox Church is not very present. That's a very huge component of ecumenical engagement, which, we do not have much experience of in Nigeria or in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa. But I think that ecumenism, however, is gradually picking up. The church generally is coming more and more to a greater understanding of each other, to more and more openness. In like the 1960s and 70s and 80s, especially from the time that Pentecostalism started, it was really greeted with great suspicion and antagonism. But go to many Nigerian Catholic churches today, you will find great obvious elements of Pentecostalism. Things that were seen as never possible in the Catholic Church are now seen as very possible. For instance, there is the Monday blessing phenomenon, which is gradually picking up in Nigerian Catholic liturgy. This is something that is, as far as I'm concerned, obviously largely influenced by Pentecostalism. The Monday blessing, by the way, is a blessing that happens after post-communion prayer every Monday, where the priest calls forward the people to give them a series of spontaneously generated blessings and sprinkles them with holy water. Many of these blessings are for things that are more material than strictly spiritual. Blessing for the weak, for success, for employment security, for things like that. This is not to say that the priests who give those blessings do not pray for more spiritual things, but I think this is more something that has been borrowed from Pentecostal ways of praying and Pentecostally inspired religious practices. So I think in that way, much more than sitting down around table to discuss about ecumenism in Africa is more organically developing and in action more than in some official discussions.
Yeah. And I'll just address the interreligious question. Of course, Christianity in Africa is always part of a three-way dialogue or trialogue with Islam, where Islam is present, with Islam and with African traditional religiosity. Some of those traditional bodies have taken institutional form, and sometimes that traditional religiosity is just kind of a cultural substratum that exists in all sorts of African believers, even if they are formally Christian or Muslim. So it's a different sort of interreligious dialogue in each case. Certainly in places where there's been conflict, like in Nigeria, Sudan, some places in Eastern Africa, between Muslims and Christians, there have been concerted efforts to have dialogues. And in both cases, of course, extremists can undermine these efforts. I think about the tragedies of Sudan or northern Nigeria or the Central African Republic in the last few years. In each of these cases, extremists have kind of hijacked any possibility for amicable interrelation. So it's an ongoing challenge for the church. I do think one of the things about North American interreligious dialogue is that it's usually got institutional support. I'm aware, for instance, of the city of Chicago, only a couple hours away from here. Cardinal Cupich sponsors interreligious dialogues among Catholics and between Catholics and Muslims, Catholics and Jews, Catholics and Hindus, Catholics and Buddhists and other believers. And so that's an example, and I know similar things happen in other dioceses across the US. There's another question from Cincinnati, Ohio, Ken, we might address, and that is, what would be some of the inconsistencies, kind of, I would say almost doctrinally, but also in church practice, between African independent churches and the Catholic Church? Now, since African independent churches take a variety of forms, we could list millions of them, but maybe it makes sense to highlight some of the important ones.
Would you want to give that a shot first?
Okay, sure. One of the things I would say is, from its beginnings in sub-Saharan Africa, missionary Christianity has been pretty hard on polygyny especially, the fact that men would have multiple wives at the same time. And certain African independent churches have allowed and embraced and welcomed polygyny. So that would be one place where, in some ways, the acceptance of polygyny was a reason for the independent church's emergence. So that's just a start. Other things you would want to mention or think about?
Yeah, that's a very good starting point. And, you know, the African indigenous church initiated churches, because of their benign disposition to African culture, some of which African cultures and practices, some of which may be inconsistent with the Christian doctrine, they are greeted with suspicion. So I give you some examples. Maybe things like masochism is common in some of the indigenous churches, African indigenous churches. When I say masochism, I mean a situation where people, in the name of preachers or pastors, in the name of wanting to drive out evil spirits, inflict direct pain. You know, some sadistic religious masochism, you know, inflict pain either using like a whip to flog people, and they make reference to scripture, like the action of Jesus using making a whip out of cords to drive people out of the temple. So this would be a very radical, you know, practice that is inconsistent with, you know, Catholic doctrine. I do not think.
Don't bring that one to St. Joe, Mishawaka. I don't think it'll.
Yeah. Unfortunately, no. Right. Well, but one of the things I want to say right away is that the African indigenous churches, unlike the Catholic Church, do not have well spelled out doctrines. So you might not find any corpus of writings that says this is the corpus of the doctrine of African indigenous churches. So depending on the inspiration and the understanding of each African indigenous church founder, they just invent what they understand to mean. I mean, they invent practices based on their own understanding of scripture and their own understanding of the Christian faith. So it's always changing from time to time.
Yeah, I remember when I first went to Nairobi as a seminarian, I was impressed by the Sunday costumes of African independent church believers in the streets of Nairobi on Sunday. Many of them took regalia that resembled that of Catholic hierarchy, dressing as bishops or cardinals or the Pope. And it was intriguing to witness this. Now, most independent churches have their origins in Protestant Christianity. There is a famous one in Western Kenya that actually has its origins in Catholic Christianity. And it's very interesting because they sort of think of themselves as more devoted to the Blessed Virgin Mary than Catholics have become. And their founder also thinks of himself as claimed to be, or is claimed to be, it's hard to know if he claimed this himself, he's now deceased, a new incarnation of Jesus. And so his mother was a new incarnation of Mary. And this church, Legio Maria, is pretty large. It has a certain base within a particular ethnic group, but it's one of the few independent churches, AICs, that has its roots in the Catholic Church.
Yeah, speaking of the devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary, one of the very popular, especially in Western Nigeria, one very popular in African Indigenous Church is the Celestial Church of Christ. Mm-hmm. And they are also big in devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary.
Oh, interesting.
In fact, once I attended a funeral of one of their members in Lagos, and it was really beautiful how much they devoted to praying through the Virgin Mary or to the Virgin Mary. I don't know much about their doctrine in that sense. And, you know, they have all of these statues and they have so many titles for the Blessed Virgin Mary. So in that sense, you know, there are also a few commonalities between the AICs and the mainline churches.
And, you know, that church does have branches also in the United States. The Celestial Church of Christ is in the US. Hey, there's one last question I want to address, and I can't remember where it's from exactly, but it asks about the Missa Luba. It was a rite, a mass that was written in the Luba language of southern Congo, near Katanga. And the person asks the question, let me just precisely name it. It says, many years ago, Congolese music with drums and local rhythms was brought together in the Latin Missa Luba. Do we have equivalent mass settings today? This is from Cheltenham in the UK. So maybe talk a little bit about liturgical music and how it is reflective of African culture that you've seen.
Well, I'll say right away that liturgical music in many African countries, Catholic churches precisely, is very different than liturgical music here. There are also many ways in which they are the same. I want to use this especially to address a concern that I have about how Catholicism is practiced in the US versus how it is practiced in Nigeria. In Nigeria, for instance, you can have a Sunday Mass where the priest seamlessly switches from one language to the other. He could begin the Mass in English and then say some parts of the Mass in Latin and say some parts of the Mass in a local language, depending on what is happening there. And the music is also the same. It is hard to go to any urban setting in Nigeria where the music will be all in one language. The music is drawn from many different languages. So we have more solemn music, we have more danceable music, we have more praise and worship kind of music. And this is standard for many Nigerian churches, unlike churches in the US here. It is not common to find churches where Mass could be celebrated in two different languages at a time, because English is the only single language. Even in parishes that are more Hispanic parishes, it's either English or Hispanic. And the same also with the music here. I think the more general directive by the congregation that is responsible for worship in Rome is that liturgical music should be well adapted to the worship of particular people in a way that it does not seem distracting and it does not seem inorganic. I am not in any way saying that Americans should begin to bring in Igbo music into their own liturgy. But what I'm trying to say is that a greater appreciation of these cultural differences and dynamics, is expected. And sometimes also some form of flexibility is also expected. I know of many Americans who are so wary of Latin, for instance, whether it be Latin in music or whether it be Latin in the parts of the Mass. So generally speaking, I think that African liturgical music is the way it is because it is more organic to Africans, and it will be very culturally strange to people in the US or to the United Kingdom where this question is coming from.
Thanks, Father Ken. We're coming about to the end of the time when you and I are going to be interacting together. And so I think it's about time we're going to be sent into these conversation circles or breakout rooms. And I just want to say, before we do that, to thank you, Father Ken, very much for joining me and joining us this afternoon, and good luck with the rest of your studies. And also to say to those participating that we'll be meeting next week in a similar, at the same time. The topic will be the future of the Catholic Church in Africa, and I'll be joined by Sister Edlaquin Shivachi, a PhD student, a Kenyan sister, and a PhD student in World Religions, World Church here at Notre Dame. And I look forward to seeing many of you then. So there are going to be some questions cast up onto your breakout room for you to discuss things you learned about this and from this conversation, and other kinds of questions that are appropriate. So I look forward to seeing some of you there. And Father Ken, if you can join one of those breakout rooms, that would also be great. And once again, thank you very much.